Dave, tell me what we're going to be seeing today.
What you're going to be seeing is a display that is really quite unusual. It's an animated wood carving that was done by 3 men in Slovakia. They did this at our request. My wife and I decided that we would like the people of America to have a better appreciation of the talent of some of these Slovak people. And so we have arranged to have these 3 men make this large display that is now here as a permanent display at Slovak Folk Crafts. We asked them to design this as if it were a large map of Slovakia. And it's made up of many different scenes. I think there's 30 or 31 different scenes that are folk life scenes that are found all over Slovakia. So this ends up being a representation of folk life as it has existed for centuries in Slovakia.
This was hand-carved by these 3 men.
That's correct. It's hand-carved from a wood called basswood, which is the preferred wood for wood carvers because it's relatively easy to carve, but it also takes stain very nicely.
How long would this have taken them to make?
It took these 3 men 2.5 years to carve this project. And because it's so large, they had to do it in sections. Their workshop wasn't large enough to do it in one piece, nor could it be shipped as one piece. So there's 5 separate sections, and each of those sections came to us separately 6 months apart.
I would like to see the instructions for putting that together.
Actually, there wasn't that much to do. They had it all assembled, the figures were in place, all of the wood carving was attached to a metal frame. All we had to do was to put wooden panels, which they made and provided. We attached those to the front, and then the figures that are across the upper part in the back had to be attached. Other than that, we just attached an electrical cord to the right terminals to the transformers and plugged it in, and it ran.
Let's talk about each individual section of it so that people at home can really have an appreciation for this. Okay. I'll let you start up at the top if you want to.
Okay, that's fine. First, I'd like to just get people oriented of what they're looking at because this is arranged as a map of Slovakia. Slovakia is situated right in the center of Europe. It's the eastern part of what used to be called Czechoslovakia. And so what we have done is to include some significant buildings across the top of this display, and they're situated according to where they are in the country. So the ones that are over here to the right are here because they're in the easternmost part of the country, and the ones over on the left are the ones that are in the western part of the country. So if we start up here at the top, this first replica that we have is a church in the village of Bardeo, which is a medieval town that is very well preserved. And this church is, we think, one of the most beautiful churches in all of Slovakia. And so we wanted that one to be included. And next to it is the tall building, a church which is found in downtown Košice. The city of Košice in eastern Slovakia is the second largest city in Slovakia. And the thing that's really significant about this church is that it's a Gothic church, and it's the easternmost Gothic structure found anywhere in the world. This is as far as the Gothic architecture went eastward. Next to that, we see another church, and this is the church that's located in the third largest city of Slovakia by the name of Prešov. And that's the city that Ann and I lived in when we were there in Slovakia in the spring of 2000 for 4 months. And next to that is a church that has 2 spires on it of equal height, and that's called Spišský Kapitál. And there's a monastery there, and there are quarters there where the Pope stays when he visits in Slovakia. And next to that, as we're moving towards central Slovakia, we see a castle ruin. This is the largest castle ruin in all of Central Europe, and it is gradually being restored, but it will take years and years for that to happen. And that's called Spiš Castle, and it's located just to the east of the beautiful Tatra Mountains. And that brings us to the center part in the back of this display. This peak is one in the mountain range of the Tatra Mountains. And the Tatras are part of the Carpathian mountain range that goes all the way across Slovakia, passes into Ukraine, and ends up down in Romania. Next to that, we see a beautiful castle that is called Bojnica. And I think it is one of the most beautiful buildings I have ever been in. A family bought that many, many years ago and spent millions of dollars on restoring it. And that's located in just west central Slovakia. The next church that we had included in this is called Nitra Cathedral. The city of Nitra is the location where Christianity was brought to this part of the world in the early 800s by St. Cyril and Methodius. In fact, we're told that the location where this church is, there are two other foundations underneath this one that were previous church buildings on that same location. And then beyond that, we see a famous castle called the Trenčín Castle. And next to that is the Bratislava Castle, which is in the capital city of Bratislava in the southwestern part of Slovakia. So that's an overview of the buildings that are replicas of actual structures in Slovakia.
This is really a history lesson whenever you stand here and look at this.
Yes, and of course there's a tremendous amount of history there. Most every village in Slovakia has a written description about the village, and almost without exception, the first sentence will say the oldest document mentioning this city dates back to, it'll be the 1200s or the 1300s. So there's just a rich history in this part of the world. And during the Second World War, there was no bombing in Slovakia, so none of these beautiful buildings were lost. And the Slovak people are marvelously peaceable people, and I think that's part of the reason why there hasn't been more destruction there.
Whenever you look at this, because like as you said, the entire top part is a replica of the different things of Slovakia, but then you get down to it, and it looks like the creators of this have handcrafted life in Slovakia.
That's right. That's right. This is folk life as it has existed in Slovakia for many years. And you could travel to villages somewhere or other in Slovakia, even today, and find people doing these things, making the things, having the kind of fun that they're having here somewhere or other in Slovakia, even today. And so let's just take a look at all these different scenes, and I will explain why they're here. And we'll just take a look at the different ones and move from the eastern part over toward the western part. The first animated figure I see is a miner, and it's interesting to me that when people come to see this here in western Pennsylvania, they say, oh look, there's a man who's mining coal. Well, interestingly, they never mined any coal in Slovakia, but of course they did here in Pennsylvania and still are. But the reason the miner is here is they have mined opal in this part of Slovakia, and they're still getting a few opal stones out of those mines. Over in the central part of Slovakia, they used to mine gold and silver. In fact, almost half of all the gold and silver that was mined in Europe came from Slovakia. So there's quite a mining history here in this little country. And of course, in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, many of those people came to America to work in our coal mines and our steel mills. And so there are still many Slovak Americans in this part of America.
Are they still doing it this way, or are they more automated today?
No, the mine that we have visited, Dan and I visited an opal mine a couple summers ago, and it was still being done by hand. Although I must say that when we visited one of the old gold and silver mines, it's open to tourists, although there's no mining activity there. We were really quite surprised as we went back in there with our hard hats and our slickers on to find a piece of equipment in there that was made by Joy Manufacturing in Franklin, Pennsylvania.
Oh my goodness. So, you go home every time you go away.
That's right. That's exactly right. So they did have that type of machinery for those bigger mines, but these are pretty small mines, and so they have the little rails and the cars that they push, and the mining, which is done by hand.
From the man who looks like is behind the oxen, it looks like there's some farming that goes on there.
Yes. Slovakia is primarily an agricultural country, and there is a lot of farming that's being done. And while this can be seen in Slovakia, you have to look pretty hard to find somebody out in the field with oxen. I've seen it only once. The fields there, particularly in eastern Slovakia, are some of the largest fields I've seen anywhere. They would rival the fields that we have here in America, in Kansas and so on. And some of the biggest farm machinery I've ever seen is in Slovakia as well. So they have the two extremes. But we wanted that to be here because it is part of the history and the culture of that particular country. Let's turn our attention to this sequence here. There's 4 moving figures that show the steps that must be taken in order to make a piece of linen. It starts down here with a woman having some sheaves of flax that have been brought in from the field, and she is using a tool which is called scutching, and that's breaking an outer shell off those stalks so that she can get at the fibers that are inside, the flax fibers, that are then given to this next lady, and she's winding those fibers onto a reel that will later be taken off there and spun into thread. And so we see the lady next to her at a spinning wheel, and she's busy with those fibers, spinning them into a long spool of thread, which is then taken by this lady who's up here at the loom. And you can see this is an actual working loom. And if it would move the thread back and forth, this would actually weave a piece of fabric. And that's the way they go from the flax in the field to a piece of linen, showing those various steps.
Now you missed, I think, a very important part. There's a clothesline there attached to what?
Attached to an outhouse. And we first noticed when this piece arrived that the door on the outhouse has a heart on it. And we thought that was kind of odd. And so we asked the wood carvers why there was a heart on the door of the outhouse. And he says, because that's what we have on doors of outhouses in Slovakia. And the ones that I've seen in America have a little crescent moon in them and so on. But in Slovakia, for some reason, they have a heart. And you'd have to look pretty hard to find outhouses nowadays in Slovakia, but they're still there in some of the smaller villages.
Well, it just was interesting because behind this entire area, I saw that, and I it's interesting he chose to put that with this particular operation.
Yes, and I don't know that there's any particular significance of that being with these ladies that are doing the textile things, but they just decided they wanted to include that someplace. And I think it's also interesting they have this little birdhouse here because there are lots of birds, and in fact their birds and their flowers and their trees are very similar to the ones that we have here in the United States. So they wanted to include that as well. And I want to make sure to point out to our viewers the trees that are in this display. And while they aren't moving, many people who come here and see this comment about how interesting and how realistic the trees look. And there's many different kinds, as we will see looking at this display, because they have so many different kinds of trees in Slovakia as well.
Would their weather be similar to western Pennsylvania?
Yes, their weather is remarkably similar, even though they're much farther north than we are. They would be on a parallel with Toronto, Canada, for example. But their weather is very much like it is here, although when we are there in the summer, they have some of the nicest, most pleasant weather I've ever experienced. Low humidity, it's bright and sunny. It's really a very pleasant place to be in the summertime. But their winters are very harsh. They have a lot of snow and a lot of cold and wind as well.
Let's take a look at another part.
All right, let's move right down front here. We asked the designers of this display to include this particular scene of 3 people because it's a custom that is practiced in Slovakia that most Americans don't know anything about. And as you'll see here, there's a young lady in the center who is kind of frolicking with these 2 fellas, and if you could see her face up close, she has a smile on her face, even though this fellow over here seems to be whipping her. And indeed he is, but he's doing it gently, and he's doing it in fun. This other fellow has a bucket, and so I need to explain to you that this custom is called watering day or sprinkling day, but some people call it dunking day because the fellows get a little carried away. This is a custom that's been practiced for hundreds of years, and the fellas will sprinkle water on the girls, but this happens only the day after Easter. On Easter Monday, they do this. And I was really curious about this custom, and so I did some research on it and found that it is not at all Christian. In fact, it's a pagan custom. And because it happens in the spring and Easter is in the spring, the two just kind of ended up being celebrated very close to the same time. So the fellows sprinkle water on the girls, and some of the other fellows will have little willow branches that they tie colorful ribbons on, and they gently whip the girls with those ribbons. And the girls will kind of egg the guys on by having little pieces of ribbon of one color or another, and after he whips her, she will give him one of those ribbons to tie on to his whip, and then he goes off and he does the same thing to some other girl. Well, recently the girls in Slovakia have decided that they needed to have a turn at this, and so now the Tuesday after Easter, the girls turn around and they sprinkle water on the guys. And so that now is being done both ways. The bell ringer is here because we wanted to have a display that included the 3-bar cross. In the eastern part of Slovakia, there are quite a number of Orthodox churches and also Byzantine Catholic churches. And you will see churches that will have 3-bar crosses that where all 3 bars are horizontal. And you'll see other churches that will have 2 horizontal bars at the top and one that is at an angle at the bottom. And we thought that was an important part of the history and the culture of the country, and that needed to be included as well. It's on this kind of structure because, for example, on the very old churches, they are wooden churches. Some of them are 400 or more years old. And those structures were not able to support the weight of a large bell on the top of the building. So they would have a little tower that would sit right beside the church and the bell up on the top of that. And so we have a fellow in here who's ringing the bell saying it's time for people to come to church. And so that's why this one is here. Now we need to point out this lady in the house here. You have to get down low to see her, but you can see that she's leaning out the window and she has her finger there and she's shaking at it because we have a dog and a cat here that are in quite a spat, and she's just tired of all that noise and barking and so on. So Mama is there saying, stop all that noise and stop fighting with each other. So that's real life. You know, that happens all over the world.
I was going to say, well, maybe that was one custom our cats and dogs got from Slovakia.
Could be. That's right. Could very well be. Well, let's move this way into another part of this display, and we'll start up here where we see a working sawmill. There is about 40% of Slovakia which is forested. And so lumbering has historically been a major industry in Slovakia and continues to be. And there's a lot of forestry work over here in this part of the country, and so we decided to situate that in here. And so we see these 2 men that are rolling a log up into the sawmill, and here we see the sawmill has 3 blades that are going up and down, powered by the water wheel, and that's cutting the log. And notice also, here's a little boy that's sitting by the sawmill, and he's been fishing, and lo and behold, he has caught a little fish. So they do that there just like they do it here.
Let's talk about craftsmanship for a minute, because what I noticed about this is the way that this log falls back down, and they try to put it back up again. And I mean, again, just the physics lesson that's involved with that is amazing.
Yes. All of what you see here is using very simple, basic physics principles with a lot of ingenuity added to it. And what's happening here is that you can't see it, but at the upper end of that, there's a piece of nylon fish line into the end of the log and goes through that wall, and that keeps the log from sliding down. Also, from that log, there's a nylon fish line that is attached to the bottom part of each of those poles that those men are using. So when they lower that pole, it actually rolls the log back again, so it's ready for them to push it up. And you see that's a very stubborn log. These fellows have kept trying and trying to get that log to roll down where the other ones are supposed to be, and they haven't yet succeeded, but they're going to keep at it.
In the United States, we would turn around and have 15 engineers on this to design this, but 3 men decided how to do all this.
That's right. They just figured out how to do it. Very ingenious. And one of the men who did the wood carving on this, I asked him about what part of this was the most difficult for him to carve. And he said one of the difficult things for him was carving these moving figures, because while he was a very accomplished carver, he had never made figures that were going to move. And he said some of these figures he had to carve 2 and 3 times to get the body parts to be shaped just right so they could then be assembled, with the pins where they needed to be so that the arms would move or the heads would turn or whatever in a very lifelike fashion. Let's move down here now, and we see two men on a crosscut saw that are busy working away cutting this big log. And of course that's something that has been done in this country for many, many years, but we can see that sort of thing being done in Slovakia as well. And there's sawdust on the ground there from where they've been busy cutting this log. And next to them is a man who is a wheelwright. He's busy making parts for a wagon, and we can see part of the wagon assembly here in the foreground, some wheels that are hanging on the wall, and he's working away there making another part for that wagon. And then down in the foreground we have some scenes, animated scenes here. And I wanted to have animation down in the front because so many families bring small children in here. We have a woman with a churn who's making butter, and this little boy is having a rollicking time on this rocking horse. It almost looks like it's a bucking bronco, and he's really hanging on there. And then we have a water well here out in the barnyard, and this fellow is stopping to take a drink of water that's from that well, and this chicken is looking at him saying, "Gee, why don't you give me a drink as well?" So that's kind of a barnyard scene here, which is just a typical scene in rural Slovakia. Now let's move back here, and we see excuse me, there's some people loading hay on the wagon in the back, with the horse standing there waiting to haul that load away. And down in front of them we see a man with a scythe who's cutting the hay, and behind him is a woman working right alongside him out in the field, and she's raking up the hay. And notice behind that there's a couple of the haystacks. It's really interesting as we travel around Slovakia. We see many, many places where they have the hay drying in those frames or wooden frames, and look around and we see different shaped frames used in different parts of the country, but they're all hanging hay on them and drying them, and after the hay is dried, then it's loaded on the farm wagon that you see up above there. And notice too that down here there's a woman who's taking her lunch. She has a blanket spread out with a loaf of bread and a pitcher with milk in it, and she right now is taking a drink out of a jug as part of her lunch. And then moving forward, we see here's three other women that are working in a potato field. The two ladies with the hose are out there digging the potatoes, and we can see behind them some sacks of potatoes that are completely filled, and they're putting potatoes in these little baskets, and then eventually we'll put them in the bag that's down here in the front. I want to make sure that the viewers see this little display with the woman on her knees rocking a baby in a cradle under a building that looks like an Indian teepee. Many people comment about that, and it's interesting to me that we see structures like that so far removed from something that we thought happened only here in the United States. But that's what they use when they have their babies out there, and these women will take turns. They'll take care of the baby for a while, and then they'll go and hoe the potatoes for a while. Let's turn our attention now to the manger scene, which is the focal point of this entire display. And the man who designed this, when he started doing one like this that is in Slovakia, his intention at that point was only to carve a manger scene. He had no thought of doing any animation. But friends of his saw that he had made this beautiful, very large manger scene and said, "Joseph, why don't you figure out how to get some moving figures, some people who could come and pay their respects to baby Jesus?" And with the help of his son, who's an engineer, he figured out how to do that in a very ingenious way. Again, a very simple principle that causes these figures to turn 90 degrees as they come toward baby Jesus and pay their respects to him. And I want to make sure that everybody sees an unusual figure that's in this display. There's a little boy there on his hands and knees offering a toy to baby Jesus. And the man who designed this, his name is Mr. Joseph Pekara. He explained that he put that little boy in there because when he was a boy that age, his most precious possession was a wooden horse on wheels, just like the one this little boy has. And he put this boy in there on his hands and knees, offering his most precious possession to baby Jesus as a tribute to his Lord.
So he put himself in the carving.
That's right. And I asked him before that, I said, I don't see a signature anywhere on this. And he said, oh, it's there. And then he proceeded to tell me about this little boy being there, and that's why he took the liberty of adding that to the scene. And we see the angel up here at the top of the manger scene. Again, just a very beautiful piece of carving.
If you look very closely, he even put Gloria in excelsis Deo.
That's right. That's right. And so that makes that stand out, and the significance of it's there. And so this is very definitely the focal point of the entire display. Now, as we look just to behind the manger scene, we see a flock of sheep. And this is probably the scene that more people comment about than any other, because it looks so lifelike. And we can see next to the sheep there's a shepherd who's sitting on a stump, and he's playing a flute. And behind him is his watchdog, or his shepherd dog, who is helping him keep these sheep together. And so they're herding the sheep and letting them pasture out there in the field. But we need to also pay attention to the display right behind it, because there's the shepherd's hut. And you see he has logs cut and so on for his fire. And we see some animals that are moving along in front of there. And we're also going to see here in just a minute a very large bear. And notice what the bear has in his front paws. He has stolen one of the sheep from this flock. And he's being chased by a big dog, followed by a man with an axe. And then he's followed up by a little boy with a stick who's going to finish that bear off. Now, let's move over here into these little workshops. Down here in the front, we see 6 men. There are 2 carpenters, 2 barrel makers, and 2 shoemakers. And these are crafts that have been done for many, many years in Slovakia, and so that's why these are here. We see 2 carpenters. One man is using a chisel and a mallet, and he's carving a large statue of some sort. The other man is working with a hand plane, has a piece of wood clamped in a vise, and he's planing that and making a beautiful piece as well. 2 men are making barrels, which they have done for many years. And next to them, we see 2 shoemakers, because they have made shoes for many, many years in Slovakia. During the communist era, many of those shoes were exported to other parts of what was then the former Soviet Union. Moving up from there, we see a group of musicians. And I was curious why these musicians were holding their violins down on their chest instead of the usual way up under their chin. And Mr. Pekara, who designed this, explained that these musicians also sing. And you can't sing very well when you have the violin under your chin. And so there's a village by the name of Turkova in central Slovakia, which is credited with having the purest form of Slovak music. And they are the ones who instituted this practice of holding the violins down on their chest instead of up under their chin, and that's why he included them in there. And we see there's a man playing a violin, and we've got a lady here with their hands on her hips that's dancing. And off to the side, there's 4 other dancers. And the men are holding axes that are called Janášek axes. And they're named after a man who was the Robin Hood of Slovakia. He robbed from the rich people and gave to the poor. And he used a big axe like that. So some of the dancers will hold axes like that as a tribute to Janášek. He was born in that same village. Moving up from there, we see an unusual structure that's a replica of a wooden church in Slovakia. That church is called Svätý Kríž, which translates to Holy Cross. It's one of the few Protestant wooden churches that remain in Slovakia. I think there's only maybe 4 of those that remain out of the 30 or so wooden churches that are in Slovakia. The other thing that's significant about this, a couple things in fact. It's the largest wooden church that exists in Slovakia today, and we're told that you can get as many as 6,000 people inside that wooden church, every bit of it built from wood. But the other interesting fact is that this church had to be moved from its original location. The place where it was originally was near a river that was decided they were going to dam up, and this building would have been lost. It would ended up being where the lake is now. So it was torn down piece by piece. and moved to higher ground. And so now it's safe and can be used. And you see a picture here of many people that are processing into that church. All right, let's move on over here to this far left-hand section, the westernmost part of Slovakia. There's a man back there that's just standing still, holding something in his hand, and that's a replica of a bigger than life-size statue of a man who's breaking his crutch. That's located in the village of Piešťany in western Slovakia, because that village is known best as the town where there are a great number of thermal spas, hot water coming up out of the ground. And different springs there have different minerals in the water, and the doctors in Slovakia have figured out that if you have arthritis, for example, you go drink water out of this spring, several times a day for a couple weeks, and that will help straighten out your arthritis. Or if you have digestive problems, you drink water from a different spring and you'll get well. And so this man is showing that he has been healed by drinking the mineral water at Piešťany, and this is the entrance into the area where those thermal spas are, complete with a little pond outside the entrance with some ducks and some lily pads and so on. And then just to the west of there, we see two men that are operating a large press. They're pressing grapes that are raised there in that part of Slovakia to make wine. And we can see some vineyards farther over to the west, and there's two people that the man has a big pack on his back, and the woman has been putting grapes in there that they will take in to be processed to make wine. And then coming down to the front of that, we see a little row of folk buildings that are really quite common in the rural villages of Slovakia, and that's just what they look like, with the wooden roofs and the log buildings, and just a very interesting kind of architecture. And then we have a scene here, quite a large scene, that shows two men making pottery. There's a village in western Slovakia by the name of Modra that's known better than any other village for pottery making. Even though they do that all over the country, this is the one that's best known for it. So one man we see is busy throwing the pots, as they say, at the potter's wheel, and the other man is busy painting one of those pieces of pottery. And there's a third man over there who's tending the kiln where the pottery is fired. And then we come down here to the front and we see a typical blacksmith shop. We have one man who's working on the anvil, while the other man is operating the bellows that keeps the fire hot enough so that it will melt whatever piece the man is using at the anvil. And then beyond that, we see two men that are putting a shoe on a horse and working together to see that they get the shoe on that horse properly. And sure enough, there's a sleepy dog down there just outside the doghouse having a good rest. So I think that pretty well covers all the scenes that you see here in Slovakia, and this by no means captures everything of the folk life in Slovakia, but I think it does a pretty good job of showing the essence of what folk life has been like there for hundreds of years.
What is the estimated value of three men doing this carving?
Well, it's a lot, and I'd like to characterize it this way so that we don't diminish the effect by saying that it's the cost of many houses here in America. So it's a major investment that my wife and I decided to do just so that people here in America can see this sort of thing, because so far as we know, there's nothing like it anywhere in the United States and perhaps nowhere in North America. And so it's open and free to the public to come and see, and we hope that when people come, they will find some things in the store that they would like to have. And by purchasing those things, they're helping us with this mission project, because that money goes back directly to the people who bought these things.